Russia is being left behind, and it's happening fast. Turkey is openly reconsidering its deals with Moscow, Scandinavia is preparing for a worst-case scenario, and Azerbaijan has demonstratively turned its back on the Kremlin. Countries that once balanced between East and West are now choosing a different future, publicly and without hesitation. NATO states are conducting military drills, evacuation scenarios are being prepared in Norway, borders are being reassessed in Finland, while Russia's shadow fleet and covert operations are taking hit after hit. Inside the Kremlin, panic management is replacing strategy. Loud statements have given way to awkward silence, denials, and damage control. At the same time, pressure is mounting elsewhere. Negotiations intensify in Washington, internal battles erupt among political elites, and decisions are being made behind closed doors that could redefine the war and Russia's place in the world. Who walked away first and who will be next? Let's break down what's happening right now. Hello, this is Ukraine Today. Maria Farafonova here with the latest updates. Turkey wants to return Russia's air defense systems and get its money back. Ankara is seeking to send the S-400 systems back to Russia to put an end to a deal that prevents the country from purchasing US F-35 fighter jets. Turkish President Erdogan raised this issue during a meeting with Russian dictator Putin in Turkmenistan. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is actively denying that any such request was ever made. Washington has recently stepped up pressure on Turkey as Ankara seeks to obtain US weapons and rejoin the F-35 program. President Erdogan discussed this issue with the U.S. president in Washington.
The U.S. president's close ally, Tom Barrack, who's ambassador to Turkey, said earlier this month that Ankara was closer to giving up the S-400s, predicting the issue could be resolved in the next 4 to 6 months.
At the same time, Ankara does not merely want to return the systems. It is demanding that Russia reimburse the billions of dollars spent on purchasing the S-400s. One possible option could be a substantial discount on imports of Russian oil and natural gas. NATO believes that Russia could obtain valuable intelligence if Turkey were to operate the S-400 systems alongside the F-35. Abandoning the Russian systems would give Ankara a major trust dividend with its allies in the alliance, as it is often accused of excessive closeness to Russia.
The U.S. kicked Ankara out of the F-35 program in 2019 in response to the acquisition of the S-400s. Washington then invoked the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, known as CAATSA, in 2020, to stop Turkey's defense industry getting access to sensitive technology.
Urgent! Moldova, together with the EU and the United States, is developing a plan to reintegrate Transnistria. This was announced by Deputy Prime Minister for Reintegration, Valerio Kiver.
We are indeed actively working on a strategy or a roadmap for reintegration. But as you know, sensitive issues require caution. We need to think through steps that will deliver results later. We cannot disclose all actions in real time, because that could harm the final outcome. The work is ongoing.
Nevertheless, the Deputy Prime Minister noted that Moldova does not want the Transnistria issue to be folded into any broader negotiations, including talks on ending the Russia-Ukraine war. Scandinavia has begun preparations for a potential Russian invasion. Finnish border guards are training for movement in snowy conditions and patrolling forested terrain. Particular attention is being paid to the municipalities of Tromsø, Finnmark, and Servaranger, whose territories are considered most vulnerable due to their proximity to the Russian border or the presence of legitimate military targets. Meanwhile, Norway has begun preparing civilian evacuation scenarios.
DSB has launched a new assessment of which areas of Norway should have plans for the evacuation and relocation of the civilian population in a wartime situation, so-called wartime evacuation. We are doing this in close cooperation, among others, with the armed forces and the police.
It is worth recalling that Russia violated Norway's airspace 3 times this year. The Prime Minister added that 2 incidents occurred over the sea northeast of Vardø in April and August, while the third took place over uninhabited territory along the land border in eastern Finnmark in July. The president of Azerbaijan demonstratively snubbed the Kremlin and refused to travel to Russia for a summit attended by Putin. Aliyev ignored the CIS heads of state meeting held on December 22nd in St. Petersburg, Russia. The reason was announced by the administration of the president of Azerbaijan.
The head of our state will be unable to participate in the informal CIS Heads of State Summit, which will be held today in St. Petersburg due to a busy work schedule.
The Kremlin said it was understanding about Aliyev's decision to cancel his visit to St. Petersburg. Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov was quick to comment, attempting to smooth over what was clearly a diplomatic setback. Earlier, Moscow claimed it was expecting a leave and was actively preparing for its arrival in St. Petersburg. However, media outlets drew an obvious conclusion: Aliyev refused to travel to meet Vladimir Putin. Over the past week, Russia has lost 2 generals. Recently, in Moscow, a car carrying General Fanil Servarov exploded. A few days earlier, reports said that General Andrei Averyanov was killed aboard one of the attack tankers belonging to Russia's Shadow Fleet. In addition, for several weeks now, Russia's Shadow Fleet has been suffering losses from attacks. We'll break down all the details in the report.
On December 22nd, around 7 a.m., a car exploded in a courtyard in the south of Moscow. By about 9 a.m., it became known that Lieutenant General of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Fanil Servarov, was killed in the explosion of this car. This is already the second news of a Russian general's death in the past week. So, as expected, Russian propaganda is starting to drown in accusations against the authorities.
Regarding the blown-up general in Moscow, I've already lost count of how many were blown up on the streets of the capital or St. Petersburg. The bill is big. It's clear that a whole special solution was thought out, and they approached it very intelligently.
Ukraine has not officially confirmed its involvement in the death, Zarvarova. However, journalists from the publication Bild suggest that this is the work of the Ukrainian special services. And if the Ukrainians are behind the general's murder, then the intention may be to destabilize the Russian general staff and society.
The message is this: we will get to you all, and for all Russians, we can bring the war to Moscow at any moment. Such assassination attempts, in addition to the targeted killing of an officer who was responsible at the highest level for training highly qualified military personnel, have several other effects: destabilization among Kremlin officials, internal decay within Russian society, and a signal that Russians will gain nothing by trying to establish relations only with the Americans while leaving the Ukrainians out.
A few days earlier, during another attack on a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker in the Mediterranean Sea, Russian General Andrei Averyanov was likely killed.
Averyanov is responsible for shadow deals, assassinations, explosions, espionage in EU countries, sabotage, and so on. He is also behind the downing of Prigozhin's plane, the poisoning of the Skripals, and so on. He carried out operations abroad on Putin's orders. He moved around the EU on vessels of the Shadow Fleet.
Russia has still neither confirmed nor denied the information about Averyanov's death. And while the information about Averyanov's elimination still needs confirmation, when it comes to the so-called elimination of Russian Shadow Fleet tankers, everything is self-evident. The Kremlin, meanwhile, claims that Kiev's attacks on oil tankers will not achieve any results and will not disrupt supplies.
This outcome will certainly not lead to the expected desired result after all. It absolutely won't disrupt any essential supplies in the very end. It will only create an additional threat. There will definitely be responses from our side.
Meanwhile, the real consequences of these attacks exist, have existed, and, as they say, will continue to exist.
What does this achieve? Well, first of all, it significantly reduces the capabilities of the Russian Shadow Fleet to transport and export raw materials, namely oil. This, in turn, means a reduction in the supply of petrodollars to the budget, real currency that is then directed specifically toward the war against Ukraine. The Russian Shadow Fleet is no longer operating as efficiently as it did, for example, a year ago.
In addition, attacks on Russia's Shadow Fleet are also a reputational blow to Russia.
But there is also a reputational aspect to this. Why is everyone so worked up about Russia? Because this reputational aspect is tied to something that has never happened during the existence of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, in such a way that its fleet is being humiliated across several seas. So, in summary,
no less painful, particularly for Russians, is the reputational blow. Attacks on airfields deep in the rear.
enemy Su-30 and Su-27 fighter jets have been hit. Video and details of the unique GUR operation in Lipetsk. The SBU struck 2 Russian Su-27 aircraft at the Belbek airfield.
So if you engage with reality, things aren't exactly going well for the Russians. But if you deny this reality, then the loss of generals is no big deal, and the loss of the Shadow Fleet won't disrupt supplies or lead to any consequences.
The Ukrainian delegation has returned to Ukraine after talks with the Americans. What news the negotiators brought back and what is happening behind the scenes of the peace negotiations between Kyiv, Moscow and Washington? That's in our report.
Talks without a breakthrough, but still a chance for peace. The head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense assessed the prospects for a peaceful resolution of the war as cautious but positive. In an interview with Forbes, Kirilo Budanov noted that his personal participation in the negotiations allowed him to gain a deeper understanding of the real intentions of the American side. Not only through the officially stated demands, but also through the signals that the White House team sends between the lines, so to speak.
In fact, they gave the process new momentum and energy. I can say that I look to the future with optimism. This is a multilateral and very complex process, not just simple bilateral negotiations.
Positive signals are also coming from the head of state. According to Volodymyr Zelensky, the work of the Ukrainian delegation with representatives of the US president was informal, but focused and productive.
There are now prepared drafts of several documents. In particular, there are documents on security guarantees for Ukraine, on reconstruction, and on a basic framework for ending this war.
The president emphasized that the wording of these documents has been formulated in such a way that they address the goal of truly ending the war and prevent any renewed aggression in the future. According to him, every round of negotiations and every meeting strengthens the protection of Ukraine's interests.
The participants in this process are beginning to take shape, not so much a peace process as it is called, but in reality it is a coalition of resistance that is emerging. And it is becoming clearer who is actually able to contribute something real to this spectacle, which in fact is something quite different. What role does Europe play here? What role does Ukraine play? And what roles do Turkey and Qatar play as well? And suddenly it turns out that this is not the show that Trump and Putin had actually planned. And I think this gives a lot of hope, because the fact that Europe has invested 90 billion euros, wow, to me, that's really serious. And apparently, this is serious for the United States as well, and they see that all their attempts to push Europe away from the negotiating table and just deal with Ukraine one-on-one, well, it's not working, it's not happening, because Europe has invested in Ukraine, and now Ukraine is a real player, and Europe is a real stakeholder. So here it seems the situation is that they decided to formalize what Ukraine, Europe, and the United States are all willing to agree to.
As always, Donald Trump remains optimistic. Answering a journalist's question at the White House, the US president stated that negotiations between Ukraine and Russia are ongoing. And according to him, they are going well.
The United States is not a security guarantor for a number of reasons. The security guarantor is Ukraine plus Europe. And those countries in Europe that are willing to support Ukraine, not just those that are part of the EU or simply located on the continent. Because there is an abundance of wealth, substantial financial resources, and ample assets that can be strategically invested in Ukraine, commencing with an initial sum of $90 billion, which would undoubtedly and profoundly undermine Putin's strategic plans and significantly jeopardize Trump's political ambitions and plans. So that's how it is. This dynamic is now becoming very clear here. And again, I'll finish where I started. Ukraine is the main character here, the main hero in this play.
But despite the positive signals, the path to peace still comes up against the most difficult and fundamental issues. Yes, peace has indeed come closer, but not because Russia has changed its position, but because the pressure on it has increased. This is what the president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, says. According to his assessment, about 95% of the parameters of a potential agreement have already been discussed. Fundamental issues remain unresolved.
The Russian economy is actually not coping very well. They have zero growth, their reserves are depleted, they have high interest rates and high inflation. And the situation is not improving.
But is Ukraine really close to peace, and more importantly, will Russia agree to peace? A question that so far remains unanswered. The main sticking point remains the issue of territory. According to US Vice President J.D. Vance's envoys, the aggressor country insists on control over the Donetsk region. Ukraine, on the other hand, sees such demands primarily as a threat to its own security. Even if, in behind-the-scenes discussions, it is acknowledged that scenarios involving lost territories may be discussed in the long term. He also listed other topics that, while less central, are still extremely sensitive in the negotiations. These include control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, possible management formats for it, the fate of ethnic Ukrainians and Russians on both sides of the front line and borders, as well as the issue of Ukraine's reconstruction.
Is a real revolt beginning in the United States against Donald Trump? Is a real revolt beginning in the United States against Donald Trump? Is the US Senate turning against the president? That same Senate has passed a major defense bill that directly contradicts Trump's ideas. Moreover, infighting has erupted within Trump's inner circle. There are serious disagreements between Rubio and Witkoff over negotiations with Russia and Ukraine. Our journalists have all the details.
Americans are rebelling against Donald Trump and forcing him to make decisions that are unpopular for him. On Monday, December 22nd, Trump signed the much-delayed National Defense Authorization Act, which determines how $900 billion of the defense budget will be spent. Its passage had been delayed since September of this year.
Now, as the new year begins and defense budgets are being adopted, well, they aren't voting for what Trump is asking for, but sometimes for those versions, those wordings, that in some ways contradict the line of the current administration.
The document contains provisions that directly contradict the new national security doctrine proclaimed by President Trump. With this law, Congress is effectively limiting a number of the Pentagon's powers, prohibiting it from acting independently on many sensitive issues.
Politicians are people who think about how to get reelected. And now, seeing these results that the local elections showed in early November, let me remind you that in the US, in a year, in November 2026, there will be the so-called mid-term elections, which are elections held in the middle of the presidential term, and during them the entire House of Representatives and a third of the Senate will be elected. And in these elections, it is quite possible, judging by the results, that a scenario could emerge that would be rather unpleasant for Trump, where the Democrats could take both chambers. And then the possibility of even a third impeachment of Trump could open up.
There is also no unified position among the top members of Donald Trump's team.
According to the American press, there are currently 3 groups of influence over Trump within the U.S. government. The first group is led by U.S. Vice President Gigi Vance. This group also includes the Secretary of the Army, Driscoll. This group, which is called the Isolationists, believes that we should not get involved in the war between Russia and Ukraine on either side. In other words, we should distance ourselves from this war as much as possible and focus on our own advancement.
American journalists report that there are serious disagreements between U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff regarding negotiations with Russia and Ukraine.
And the other group, which is informal, is led by Witkoff himself and also includes Jared Kushner, the husband of Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump. These are Trump's business partners who don't think in terms of state interests, but rather in terms of business interests, in terms of profit, in terms of deals. These are people who are susceptible to material rewards. Accordingly, Russia was able to establish a dialogue with them and explain that it is more beneficial for the US to be with Russia than against it.
It is precisely this that experts associate with the current warm dialogue between Russia and the US, which is taking place with mutual exchanges of courtesies and gifts.
Stay with us to be the first to know what's happening right now. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. See you soon.